Now, the second part is why is sex? Before we examine why sex is, let's look at why life is. Indeed, that may be easier to explain. Far from defying the second law of thermodynamics as commonly believed and asserted by people as different as atheist philosopher Daniel Dennett and Pope Pius VII, the latter of whom invoked the second law as proof of God's existence because life seems to violate a universal mandate towards disorder, organisms continuously produce entropy, and thermodynamics a measure of the spread of energy. At our scale, energy delocalizes and organisms increase this natural process. Indeed, life's complex systems spread more energy, produce more entropy than would be the case if they were not there. Prokaryotes actively seek out redox and photosynthetic gradients and disperse them, spreading energy and producing entropy as they metabolize, grow, and reproduce. So do we. Living systems from cells to multi-cell organisms to ecosystems are open thermodynamic systems. Fluid dynamic and weather systems such as Baynard convection cells, giant Hadley cells in Earth's atmosphere, dust devils, hurricanes, whirlpools, and chemical clocks are all non-equilibrium thermodynamic systems that tend to swirl into being in areas where there are sufficient temperature and pressure, electron potential, or other physical gradients. The temporary organization and cycling of matter that they exhibit reduces an ambient gradient, produces heat, and then when nothing is left to degrade, they disappear. Their organization was for a prosaic purpose, energy degradation. Life on Earth appears to be a similar non-equilibrium entropy-producing system. A difference is that the gradient, the difference across a distance, Earth life is ultimately helping reduce is not a local pressure gradient or a gradient reduced by an autocatalytic chemical reaction, but the relatively immense gradient between incoming short wavelength solar radiation from the 5,700 centigrade surface of the sun and 2.7 Kelvin outer space. Despite being marginal in quantity, life seems to be organized to reduce this solar gradient, as suggested by the cool temperatures recorded by weather satellites over the Borneo and Amazon rainforests in midsummer, equivalent to those over Siberia in midwinter. Biodiverse ecosystems actively dissipate energy away from their sensitive surfaces, incrementally enhancing the production of entropy, the spread of heat, which cannot be used for metabolic purposes. If life could, it would swallow the sun, but it can't. Instead, sophisticated ecosystems move the waste heat away from themselves. Thus, far from violating the process of spreading energy described by the second law of thermodynamics, living systems take in energy, build form, and cycle matter in order to degrade available energy. Dissipation seems to be their natural purpose. Organisms not only reduce gradients, but in doing so, they exhibit a natural intelligence, likely accompanied by sensation. For example, when bacteria swim up a sugar gradient, or when sunflowers slowly bend to follow the path of the sun in a field in Spoleto, Italy. I would argue that our own intelligence is an evolved form of the tendency for entropy production seen even in non-living systems. We can see mind-like behavior even in very simple non-equilibrium systems. Consider a streamer of hot air in a house with leaks. As the insulator watches, it comes through an electric outlet, moves up a wall, halfway across the ceiling, and then, as if changing its mind, it reverses direction, goes down the wall, and escapes through the same outlet whence it came. Mind and life are connected, and the connection is through finding stable ways to reduce gradients, differences across distances. Bill Early at Georgetown University, founded by Jesuits, was carrying a Belousov-Zhabotinsky reaction in an elevator when two priests got on. The chemical reaction slowly spiraled and changed color. One of the priests watched in wonder. "Are those alive?" he asked. Early paused. No, Father, they are just like you. They metabolize, but they don't reproduce. I mention all this because the thermodynamic imperative to find energy, ultimately solar excess, and use it to maintain form offers a compelling explanation of why life exists. When the flesh wanes, the form appears. Life's open systems are connected to the natural process of energy degradation extending over eons and described by the second law. Understanding why life exists may give us insight into why sex exists. In his letters to his son on the art of becoming a man of the world and a gentleman, Lord Chesterfield, the 18th century British statesman, had this to say to his son about sex: the expense is damnable, the pleasure momentary, and the position ludicrous. So why sex? Reasoning that selfish genes would replicate much faster if they did not have to go through all the bother of finding mates, fertilizing, or being fertilized by them, and then diluting their genomes in the process, neo-Darwinists argued sex must have a purpose. Otherwise, why would selfish genes put up with them? The main reason they found was that reproductive sex mixes, the sex of sexual reproduction creates variety, phenotypic diversity. This could be advantageous. For example, sex might help in avoiding population collapse from a rapidly spreading pathogen, which would have to change and therefore would be slowed as it moved to organisms with different phenotypes. Evolutionary biologist Lee von Valen originally presented this idea in an ecological context as the Red Queen hypothesis. To compete in an environment with sexually reproducing organisms, other organisms must also be sexual. Van Valen named his theory after the Red Queen in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass. The Red Queen tells Alice, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. And there is some evidence for this idea that by shuffling their genes, sexually reproducing organisms are better at eluding parasites. Researchers in Mexico separated asexually cloning and sexually reproducing small freshwater fish, minnows, into different ponds. Then they counted black spots caused by a parasite and found that the asexual minnows were far more prone to disease than their genetically more varied sex relatives. By obligately shuffling their genes each time they reproduce, sexual reproducers seem to be able to keep a step ahead of quickly evolving pathogens. And this is still largely accepted in neo-Darwinism. It answers the question, if I can clone myself, why would I want to give away half my genes to some man or woman I hardly know? And some animals seem to have avoided this wasteful giveaway. Consider those whiptail lizards in the southwest United States. They are all females, but when one gets on top of another to have a good time, she produces even more eggs. They don't need males to reproduce, neither do aphids that feed on rose bushes and many other organisms. If these organisms can survive without males, the neo-Darwinists wondered, why haven't more organisms become asexual? Some organisms, such as hydras, switch from asexual budding to sexual reproduction when times get harsh, for example, from cold or starvation. They seem to have found a way to lose sex but return to it in harsh conditions. But if reproductive sex has evolved to maintain genetic variety, why is it that, as Graham Bell of McGill University in Montreal reported in his book, The Masterpiece of Nature, why do they show plenty of genetic variety? Dandelions, which are clones, show ample genetic variety despite their lack of sexual reproduction. Is there something wrong with the widely believed idea that sexual reproduction persists because of the advantages produced by genetic recombination? Well, as my mother, Lynn Margulis, pointed out, and you botanical voyeurs probably know as well or better than anyone, it is not so easy to get rid of sexual reproduction. The whiptail lizards, the dandelions, the aphids, and others are not so much asexual as formerly sexual. They are apomictic. Apo from Greek for after or away from, as in the word apology, something said after and away from what was said before. The answer seems to be that getting rid of mixes isn't as easy as dropping a term in an equation. Some organisms have found ways to bypass it, but not all. Organisms like dandelions and whiptail lizards and many plants that are often called asexual still contain remnants of their former sex lives. They may not need males anymore, but their ancestral species had them. Their ancestors practiced biparental sex, as the example of humping lesbian lizards laying more eggs suggests. Indeed, if we apply Ernst Mayr's biological species concept mentioned earlier, populations of asexually, that is apomictically reproducing eukaryotes, may not even belong to a species anymore, as they no longer sexually reproduce. They are part of populations, and while they may be able to reproduce faster, they may also be more fragile, more at risk of dying out all at once, for example, from infection or lack of food. In Origins of Sex, 4 billion years of genetic recombination, which I happen to have right here, Lynn and I suggested reproductive sex evolved when starving protists ingested but then did not fully digest their own kind. Powered by the same maternally inherited aposymbiotic mitochondria that are powering this talk, Lynn Margulis was a tireless teacher and researcher. In her studies, she discovered that the Harvard University biologist Lemuel Roscoe Cleveland had chronicled examples of cell cannibalism and, in at least one case, in 1947, cell fusion with 2 nuclei that doubled its chromosome numbers. Was this, in the haploid protists he studied, a prototype for the origins of fertilization? If such diploidy had arisen in the laboratory, it must, he reasoned, have happened many times in evolution. She agreed. Threatened by starvation and desiccation, cells sometimes ingested each other. But without immune systems, they didn't always fully digest or reject what they had ingested. Sometimes both survived. Today, deprived of water and nutrients, dinomastogotes fuse to form resistant cysts. Cleveland observed cell fusion in hypermastogotes left out to dry during the molting of wood-eating termites. Cell fusion, followed by merging of cell and nuclear membranes, was a neat explanation for the adventitious origins of diploidy. It must have happened often, and cells must have often, however uncomfortably, reproduced in such fused states, forming early diploid bodies, protosporophytes. But then there was a big problem. How would the merged cells or their clonal diploid protobodies recover from their monstrous doubled states? Cleveland called this the problem of the relief from diploidy. How do we recover our original state? Today we are all stuck, doubled monsters, monstrous clones longing to return. But the way back is through not just sex, but aging and death. Our bodies are disposable. Thus, when we feel trapped in a relationship, it may be a kind of existential apprehension of a deeper biological situation. We exist as multicellular diploids, but to repeat these forms, we must revert to our ancient protist starting points, the haploid. When the flesh wanes, the form appears. In Lynn Margulis's view, the neo-Darwinist notion that sexual reproduction is maintained because of the advantages of recombination was short-sighted. It assumed that it was easy to lose mixes, sexual reproduction, but it wasn't, she suggested. The basic processes of meiosis that led to the production of haploid cells, combined with the doubling of those cells, performed crucial functions. Without them, or versions of them, tissue differentiation couldn't occur. So-called asexual animals are not completely asexual, as they still undergo processes that had originally arisen in the evolution of sexual reproduction. For example, fertilization, now by their own haploid cells, as in the whiptail lizards. Despite a temporary ability to reproduce faster, Members of such clonal populations deprived of mictic genetic recombination may, like early settlers in ecosystem succession, have an initial advantage, but in the long run be replaced by more biodiverse communities, as well as more exposed to catastrophic die-offs due to their relative genetic uniformity. This may be why, in both plants and animals, sexual reproducers remain more prevalent than apomictic forms. Moreover, if there are more apomictic plants than animals, it may be a reflection of their relative amorphousness and the greater number of complexly articulated tissues in many animals versus plants. All this should not, however, be interpreted to imply that animals are superior. From a metabolic perspective, plants can do everything animals can do and more. They respire and photosynthesize. All animals are parasites. Plants and photosynthetic bacteria and algae own the means of production. They produce themselves from water, sun, and air. While astronomers search for life in space at the 21 centimeter wavelength of the electromagnetic spectrum and elsewhere, plants commune directly with visible starlight in the 400 to 700 nanometers range, soaking up the solar electromagnetic spectrum from its nuclear source 93 million miles away and dispersing it as long-wave radiation heat, in part by massive evapotranspiration in the world's temperate forests and tropical rainforests. The neo-Darwinist William D. Hamilton, whom Richard Dawkins called my intellectual hero and, quote, the nearest equivalent to Darwin we have in the 20th century, admitted that when he used the term evolution of sex, he really meant the maintenance of sex. But like Margulis, he was a true naturalist as well as a theorist. He loved being outdoors and surrounded by living beings. Indeed, they contributed to his stomach and health problems. He was in an uncomfortable semi-symbiosis with the protist Plasmodium, the malarial parasite, and Giardia, both entering his body and never leaving during his travels. Nevertheless, Hamilton's body, serving as a host for protists, helped him to see clearly his basic biological destiny. He wanted, quote, to be carried to Brazil, he said. In his last will and testament, he wrote, the coprophanius beetle to bury me, to enter, live on my flesh. In this way I will escape death. No worm for me, nor sordid fly. I will buzz in the dusk like a huge bumblebee. I will be many, buzz even as a swarm of motorbikes reborn into the Brazilian wilderness beneath the stars, and finally shine like a violet beetle in the sun. In his later years, after his forays into neo-Darwinist math arguing for the maintenance of sex and the inevitability of aging, it's not, some animals don't age, Hamilton admitted that when he used the term evolution of sex, he really meant the maintenance of sex, but, he added, the term evolution of sex was more, quote, sexy. From a selfish gene perspective, why would organisms evolve to mix their genes with others when they could just clone themselves asexually? The idea of one microbe engulfing another and doubling its chromosome numbers fascinated Hamilton, but it also disturbed him. In his only book, Narrow Roads of Gene Land, a 3-volume collection of his papers with commentary, Hamilton called Margulis a, quote, high priestess. She called him, another neo-Darwinist, puerile numerologists. Understanding the evolution of mixes may be as difficult as, and related to, understanding the tumultuous nature of human sexual relationships. Love is hard. You can't merge with the other person, but you wouldn't want to. You must merge and not merge. Be double, but also single. This problem goes back to the protists. We are fractally reliving an ancient dilemma. The problem continues to be how to get back to square one, the original single-cell state. Getting there can be a lot of fun, but it also takes our brain-identified lives with it. In the aborted cannibalism of primordial diploids, neither partner can win, or both will perish. That's still our situation. It's tough. Not all protists indulge in making what Shakespeare called the beast with two backs. Indeed, as Margulis pointed out about Stentor coeruleus, whenever it attempts to mate, both partners inevitably die. In this species, she concluded, sex is clearly on its way out. Today, in humans, the moment of sexual passion brings together sex cells in appearance much like ancestral protists. We ourselves are a kind of time machine, with sex bringing us back to a primitive state. If either sex won in the battle of the sexes, both would die. This is the story, anyway, that made William D. Hamilton's eyes grow wide. Looking through all 3 volumes of his only book, Narrow Roads of Geneland, only once did I encounter a 4-letter word capitalized with an exclamation point. In the second volume, entitled The Evolution of Sex, Hamilton imagines a crowd at a Roman circus, the Colosseum perhaps. The crowd cheers wildly at the unlikely, if not impossible, sight of their own colloidal translucent ancestors, giant sumo-like wrestler cells, going at it, wrangling to the non-death. As the ancient microbes, each trying to phagocytize the other, struggle, the crowd calls out, "Draw, draw." That is how he writes it. Hamilton, all capitals and with exclamation points to emphasize how important this match was, not least of all for the audience whose very existence depends on the outcome. They hope neither side will win. Assuming the scientific story is true, and it may well be, does it not help explain the mixture of emotions we sometimes feel hundreds of millions of years later in our relationships? Feeling alone, we want to get together, but then coming together, we want to be alone again. Even in ourselves, we are not alone. As a coda, I would like to mention that Richard Dawkins' intellectual hero, Hamilton, also wrote a paper mathematically proving, using neo-Darwinist math, that aging must exist. However, senescence, aging, in the precise statistical sense of being more likely to die next year than this, does not seem to exist, and certainly not equally in all animals. Clams and whales can live for hundreds of years. There are few, if any, signs of aging in turtles and sharks. Sexually mature stressed jellyfish, such as Turritopsis dohrnii and species of the jellyfish genus Aurelia, can revert to the polyp stage. Carrion beetles, Trogodermal glabrum, if starved, revert through a series of larval stages until they look like newly hatched maggots. Parenthetically, stressed ecosystems also revert to earlier stages, and so even do inanimate complex thermodynamic systems like Taylor vortices. When the rotational pressure gradient which feeds their organization is lowered, they revert back, jumping in precise sequence to fewer pairs of counter-rotating vortices. That could be analogous to like having a low food supply with less energy. You revert back adiabatic or evolutionary paths. One traditional theory of aging is that energy used for reproduction makes organisms die. Yet lobsters become larger and more fertile as they age. We age relatively gradually, but it is very unlikely that the cause is inevitable gradual decline from free radical damage. Life long ago found ways, including free radical scavengers, to protect from oxygen damage. Meanwhile, some organisms age almost instantly. Salmon die immediately after laying their first, or in some species, second batch of eggs. They are flooded by steroid hormones and then fungal infections and die. The adult mayfly lives only 1 day, and the Rocky Mountain locust, which once flew in a swarm as big as the state of California, is now extinct. Theoretical biologist Middledorf co-wrote a paper using the same math neo-Darwinists used to show sex is maintained by variety, to show that aging also maintains variety. A better answer, though, may be that aging prevents populations from growing too fast and thus dying out all at once from starvation, infection, or predation. It is clear that there is lots of sex, and aging unto death in eukaryotes, including ourselves. Aging, sex, and death are facts of our lives. They work in fact, but as the joke goes, will they work in theory? For both aging and sex, from the standard neo-Darwinian points of view, the answer seems to be no. Nonetheless, the variety of sex, and this may be important to keep in mind for those contemplating how to increase food production by bypassing mixes, may be a hallmark of Earth life's most evolved ecosystems, including the jungle surround of William Blake, tiger burning bright in the forests of the night, an imaginary feline who lusts for flesh in a double sense, as befits his ancient protist origins. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dorion. We'll give you a big virtual applause. It was fascinating piece, and we're certainly full of ideas and questions, especially from the young guys from the lab. I will let them speak first and try to bring some comments and questions at the end on myself. But I'll let people ask whatever they want. So the forum is open for questions or comments from this brilliant piece that Dorion has just shared with us that has so many elements to think about, I think. And we'll certainly go further a little bit with it.
Hi, good morning. My name is Daniel. I am a laboratory technical, and I'll try to speak English as best I can, but if I can't, I will need help. What do you think about other theories on the origins and the reason of the set, in particular the Red Queen theory?
Oh, thank you for the question. I think I think I answered that. It seems like it may be important that the variety created by sex may be one of the things it does. It's interesting that there are even in the species that have evolved ways of bypassing sex that under stress, like I mentioned with the hydras, under conditions of starvation, they sometimes go back to sex, and it makes you wonder. It makes me wonder, anyways, whether it it is often advantageous in the short term to reproduce asexually as a eukaryotic organism, but if the going gets really tough, or you're in a long-term stable ecosystem with limited space, like in the Amazon rainforest, it's better to be sexual, because that's like the full flowering, the most diversity, and the most sort of a metabolic turnover. Whereas, the basic mode of asexual organisms, which obviously there's some selective pressure to become asexual too in certain cases, and I think those cases would be more like early ecosystems, the spreading phase, where you have a lot of things that you can get at metabolically. But then after that's done, you have to be more careful about the organization, and that would favor sexual organisms. So I think that part of the Red Queen hypothesis, it makes sense, but then there are also situations where asexual or apomictic reproduction would be favored, and but also, as I mentioned, it's not that easy to get rid of sexual reproduction, and even there's a lot of people, a lot of human beings would like to reproduce without going through cloning scenarios, etc., and it's still not it's not practical. So it's not that happening. Probably the more complex and differentiated you are, the more difficult it may be to get rid of sex. So it's not a simple, it's not a very cut and dried question. There's multiple aspects, and it's not automatically easy to get rid of sexual reproduction, even though it may be desirable in some cases.
If I will take advantage to add up something interesting that you might have heard about. In 2019, there is a French group that has suggested that perhaps another explanation could be related to what he calls parasitic inherited cells. In other words, cancer cells that could, by phagocytosis or endosymbiosis, start forming their own colonies within an organism and inheriting their behavior from one generation to the other. And that perhaps sexual reproduction could have evolved as a means to avoid that. It's a very recent theory. And it has received some attention by the community, but perhaps not enough. It needs perhaps some deep thought about it. But it's a different theory from the Red Queen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's different versions of the Red Queen too. That was just a very sort of like abstract general portrayal of it. I mean, cancer. My mom, cancer, because it's mitotic, tends to be a reversion to an earlier sort of cellular reproductive schedule. And in the eukaryotes that are affected by cancer, which are not, it's not the same. Like naked mole rats never get cancer, whereas laboratory mice like the oncomouse, they get cancer all the time. And from an aging perspective, I co-wrote a book with this guy I mentioned, the second author, Josh Middledorf, called Cracking the Aging Code, very commercial title, but it's an interesting thesis. The cancer, theoretically, if you get rid of the taboo in neo-Darwinism for group selection, can be very useful along with other things, including viruses, you could imagine, as ways to control, not obviously in a cognitive pre-planning way, but looking at it in retrospect, the suicidal tendency of hyper-reproduction. For Middledorf, inflammation, which is good in your immune system, but is also implicated in some of the multiple diseases of aging unto death, apoptosis, insulin-related things, thymic involution, which is a part of the brain. All these things can be recruited evolutionarily into preventing organisms, especially from clays that tend to grow too fast, from doing that. Because if they do, as with, and it might not have been clear in my talk, the Rocky Mountain locust, here's an organism that was so populous, even though it was sexually reproducing, it's reminiscent of an asexual organism because there were so many of them. They descended on the agricultural Midwest in the United States, devoured. It was part of the Dust Bowl effect in the Depression. And then there's no living specimens left. So when you do that, when you're so successful in the short term, you can destroy your chances in the long term. So especially in organisms that tend to grow really fast, like mice and certain insects, etc., it would be very advantageous to age, because otherwise you might be so successful that you destroy yourself. So I think that my own opinion is that, it's from that rodent, naked mole rat mice comparison. The naked mole rats are like, they're eusocial. They're living in tunnels in Africa. They're not in any immediate danger of hyperpopulation, whereas that can't be said of the, ordinary mice. So I think that's something to look at when you think about cancer, as well as the tendency for the cancer cells are basically mitotic. So I don't know much about the theory that you suggested, but that's what I
was just throwing it up. Why do plants do not get cancer? Lab. I'm asking the lab. I'm not asking you in particular.
Oh yeah.
It's an interesting question. We don't have cancer in plants. We have these galls that are formed by bacteria infection. Yeah. But there is not sort of.
Well, I don't know that. I don't know anything about that. But I do know that interesting. I know there's an interesting theory about the origin of fruit being from fungi or insect galls, because they form these structures, and it's hard to kind of imagine, but if that somehow made them really sweet and there was mammals around and it helped them to reproduce, it's the type of thing that does happen and did happen many times in evolution, is like these accidents and infections turned out to be, you know, desirable features in the aftermath, including our own mitochondrial ancestors.
Definitely. Other questions or comments for Dorion, please, go ahead.
Hi, Dorion. Thank you for your very nice talk.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you. I'm Quetzely. From an evolutionary perspective and following Maynard Smith, sexual reproduction should be more costly than any other form of clonal reproduction. Do you believe that multicellular eukaryotes, especially humans, could eventually adapt to less costly asexual methods of reproduction?
I'm sure some people would like it, but I mean, a dictator might like to reproduce himself. I mean, I wouldn't. I think I'm already a little bit more than enough of one of me. But to go back to what I was saying about aging, I mean, there's a problem with rampant growth, and that's exacerbated by the opposite of sexual reproduction. So you know, I think the human species is a great example of the problem, because we age and we come from, you know, rodent-like mammals that were probably one of those clades that reproduce plenty fast enough by themselves. And as we can see, you know, I calculated the growth curve of a baby son when he doubled his weight in the first 6 weeks. At that, and you know, that's the exponentially growing zygote into the embryo, the blastula, gastrula, and then you get a fetus, an embryo, baby, and then the baby grows, doubles its weight in 6 weeks. Well, if you extrapolate that, in 3 years he weighs like over 2,000 tons. That's not how evolution works, but that is how the human species is working, even with aging as part of its sexual reproduction. So there's more than twice as many people on the planet than when I was born. We have used all of our so-called intelligence and technology in order to circumvent what looks like very old and powerful restraints on the tendency for exponential growth. So we have to be very careful. What we call intelligence in many ways is maybe the exact opposite of wisdom in terms of knowing our place as part of an ecological community. We are not the drivers. We are feeding up the ecological communities. Half of the phytomass on the planet has apparently been destroyed since the Holocene. So we're growing rampantly, and we're destroying the means of production which are supporting us. And I think that cloning would only exacerbate that problem. As would you know, circumventing aging, which a lot of people would like to do too. But I think you should go for it if you want to.
Freedom of decision. Free will. Any other question or comment? Please go ahead.
Okay. Sorry. Gloria?
Yes, again?
Dulce?
Can I?
Oh,
You or me?
Dulce, whoever wants to take over. Go ahead,
Okay.
Dulce. Go ahead.
You or me?
Dulce first.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Well, Dorian, I'm Dulce. I'm a master student in the Apolab in now. Well, my question is, in your opinion, why is that life does not comply to the second law of thermodynamics? Could it be related to the reproductive capacity of living organisms?
Well, I think you misunderstood Dulce. Dulce? I think I didn't say, I said the opposite. I said that that life contradicts the second law of thermodynamics, but that really it doesn't, because the second law of thermodynamics was described first in terms of isolated systems. And if you have a box and it's closed, or leaving aside gravity and stuff, and if you have heat on one side and cold on the other, it comes to a lukewarm temperature. And that very simple experimental setup was, before evolution in the 19th century, it was the first sort of scientific view that was replacing religion of the fate of the universe, which was the so-called heat death of the universe. By extrapolating what happens inside a closed system, materially closed, covered, you get this view that everything comes to a stasis, and differences become rectified, and then the end is disorder, quote unquote disorder. The term disorder is a common language description after like hundreds of pages of math and Ludwig Boltzmann's lectures on gas theory. And so it's really not a particularly helpful way of understanding. And I don't pretend to be an expert, but I did talk to the guy who died a couple of years ago, Frank Lambert, who was successful in changing the definition of entropy in all of the major chemistry textbooks and some of the physics textbooks in the United States, from this idea of disorder. And he pointed out that almost any collection of atoms above absolute zero is almost infinitely disordered. And he wanted to redescribe it. And it's something that I've embraced and incorporated into my talk, that the basic idea of the second law of thermodynamics is describing concentrated energy that spreads out. And it's a natural tendency at our scale. At astronomical scales, gravity can create gradients, but at our scale, differences tend to be used. And that's what the whole technological, not only life, but our technology is feeding off of, the fossil fuel concentrated potential energy. And so we are hardly, since we're not in a box, we're in an open universe, an open system. At the planetary scale, it's mostly a closed system in a technical thermodynamic sense, that the energy is coming from the sun, and most of the matter is turning around. Some space junk goes out, some meteors, etc., come in, but basically we have this system of turning things over. But there's still heat being dissipated, so it's not closed. So the main thing from a thermodynamic perspective that Earth is doing is spreading energy, and that's what we do. When we get hungry and it tastes good, we're breaking down chemical gradients with oxygen and growing, or at least metabolizing. And all life, if it's not in some kind of spore form or seed or waiting form, is doing that. That's what life is. Life is, you're alive because you're more alive when you're dancing than when you're sleeping, and you're more alive, you're not alive at all when you're in a bullfight and the bull is fighting the matador, and then the bull dies. It looks like it's the same physiochemical composition, but it's no longer autopoietic. It's no longer metabolizing, so it's no longer life. So life is, far from violating the second law of thermodynamics, is actively participating in the spreading of energy that is codified by the second law of thermodynamics. And that's possible because we're open systems. But it's not only that it doesn't violate the second law, the behavior described by the second law of thermodynamics, but it actively participates in that. So it's exactly the opposite of what people still often invoke as, the mysterious power of life to violate the second law of thermodynamics. And I consider that a kind of Copernican revolution, along with the idea that Earth is not at the center of the universe, and that organisms are not, human beings are not the highest forms created by God, the evolutionary deconstruction, and also, the destruction of vitalism by the discovery, for example, of Wohler, I think it was, that, you can get organic compounds from it. We're not made out of a special stuff. We don't live in a special place. We're not the most highest life form. And the process in which we are engaged as living beings is also not special. It's a kind of thing we see around us. And I find that very intellectually exciting and also kind of comforting, and because it connects us. You know, it might make us feel like we're not special, but the flip side of that is that it connects us to the rest of the universe, and I think in a very intellectually satisfying, and it intuitively feels very right to me.
And in that regard, if I may ask a corollary question, your view kind of brings the question immediately to the universe, to the cosmos. And perhaps this has more to do with Carl's legacy in terms of how do you relate to the possibility of this not uniqueness of our planet and the way it organizes itself with other form of life, if any? How do you relate to it? Could this experiment, if I can, maybe it's a silly word for it, could this Earth experiment we're in, with all its non-uniqueness, have repositories somewhere else?
Well, I do think that that particular thermodynamic perspective, it does nothing to dash the hopes of those searching for life in outer space. But, you know, as far as the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, I think that considering the fact that it's difficult for me to understand you guys when you speak Spanish, and we're in the same species, and then we think about other organisms on our planet. I mean, it wasn't until Leeuwenhoek started looking through a microscope and saw these weird things and had no idea that they could be infectious or that they were all over people's bodies at first, that microbes were discovered. So, you know, we don't know what it's like to be another from the inside. It's always a form of projection. It's always like an existential state of solipsism. So, you know, I think if we open our eyes, you know, there are people who argue that with scientific credentials that stars are life, or idealist philosophers that say that when we look at the universe, what we see, we think of it as a third person view, but actually from the universe's point of view, it's another eye, you know? And so we're like looking at the brain of a giant being. You can make a lot of speculative arguments, and I think you should be open to them. And I think that indigenous peoples were much more open to others in a way that Westerners have tended not to be, in part because of the church. For example, Eduardo Castro de Viveros, in talking about the Amazon tribes, it's very common to think of, say, a bird, the feathers of a crow as the clothing of the crow, or for the leopard who drinks the blood of a human. It's like, for him, it's like Maniac beer. So we should have an openness, a potential openness to other beings. And I think that applies very prominently to non-human life forms, including all cells, you know, and it may go further than that. So I think as far as the existence of others, you know, we're surrounded by others right now. We ourselves may be constructed of others, and what that suggests about the vast universe outside us is, I don't think it's cut and dried either way, but it does show that there's an almost infinite number of perspectives, and that, you know, there has to be some work done with the division between what the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus distinguished between the cosmos koinos, the common universe of science, and then the private world, which is just as real, the idios cosmos, and all beings would have that. And, you know, do you have to have a brain to do that? I don't think you do. When you think about cells, I mean, it seems to me that there would be more of a tendency for them to feel pleasure, for all cells to feel pleasure. After all, our brains and our bodies are constructed of cells too. Now, there's definitely special things, information processing, etc., that our brains do, but they may also cut away possibilities. So, I mean, in terms of connection, I think we have plenty of evidence right here that there's a lot more connection that we're right here on Earth, and then, you know, then there's the whole rest of the universe. But put our own house in order first.
Gloria, go ahead. You had a question.
Hello, Dorian. I'm
Hi.
happy to hear you. I have two questions. My questions are superficial questions. Have two. My first question is, I want to know what do you think about the sex with pleasure or pleasure with sex? Because I think that this is another kind of evolution, no? Because if you know, there are only 3 animals that have sex with pleasure: bonobos, human, and dolphins. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't know. Where did you get? I think that goes back to the last question. I mean, I could definitely believe bonobos have pleasure when they have sex, and I definitely believe some humans have pleasure when they have sex, and I definitely believe that that dolphins may have pleasure when they have sex. Hopefully not too much when they with the reports of the gang rapes of the males by the females, but they may have pleasure too. But I absolutely think that sounds very arbitrary to say that those are the 3 species that have sex. So I don't see any evidence for that.
You see the possibility of other species having pleasure.
Yeah, I tried to allude to that fact that I think that it's very possible that when a cyanobacterium or some of the plants that you studies, when they open their leaves to the sun, they're feeling pleasure. Why not? That's what I would do if I was a plant.
Yes, another question is, do you like Charles Bukowski?
Oh, that's right. No,
Yes.
I don't know if that's. I do. I bought that from a friend a long time ago, but that's not to make any like grand claim. But I do like Bukowski and his poetry, especially. And actually, I don't know if you noticed, but I think that I stole from him in the part of my talk where it said, when the spirit wanes. I don't think I said the spirit wanes. I think I said when the body wanes or something. But he actually sent out a postcard one year. When the spirit wanes, it was a whole book, but it was like 6 words. When the spirit wanes, it was a Christmas card, the form appears. So he actually influenced my talk too.
Nice, thank you. Are there any other questions or comments for Dorion?
I have one question.
Go ahead, Iván, please.
Hello, Dorian.
Hi.
Yes, I feel very pleasure to hearing you. And well, I'm Iván. I'm a master's student from the Apple Lab as well. And coming back to the thermodynamics view, I understood that you mentioned that we as life or living things, we are dissipative structures similar to twisters. And like our purpose could be like dissipate the sun gradient, right? But my question is if, for example, twisters are very common. We see twisters appear and disappear everywhere, but we don't see that with life. Like life is not as common as a twister in the universe. And I was wondering why was that?
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, then Freeman Dyson, who I mentioned, he wrote a book called The Origins of Life, and he actually suggested a double origin. So the basic point isn't that that there isn't a huge difference between dissipative systems and living systems, but rather that living matter is a form of dissipative system, but it has a genetic architecture, which it allows it to continue doing what it's done and to evolve via reproduction. But at its essence, rather than being a replicative system, which would be one of the 2 origins that Freeman Dyson was talking about, it's a metabolic system, or at least on equal footing. So you could have had sex. In my first version of this talk, I had a 3rd section, When Was Sex, which talked about the early Earth without oxygen in the atmosphere, because the cyanobacteria didn't put it there until 2 billion years ago. There would have been no ozone layer, and therefore ultraviolet radiation, which tends to like hit bacteria, create bacteriophages, and lead to more sort of bacterial sex, was not yet in place. That sort of world of like irradiated RNA world, irradiated molecules, genetic recombination could have been even older than life. It could have been sex before life. And then, but life proper is autopoietic, to use the Francisco Varela Uberto Maturana word for organisms, for the basic activity of life, like the bull. The bull, when he gets killed, is no longer metabolized. He's no longer autopoietic. He's no longer self-producing himself in a recursive fashion, which is a hallmark of life. And that cyclical process is, to me, is very similar, and in fact, a very refined example of the kind of thing that happens in the fluid dynamics systems, like a simple twister, or, you know, a tornado in a bottle. Yeah, you know, a tornado in a bottle, it's like a little hole in two bottles, and you put liquid on one, and then it makes a little whirlpool. Well, the interesting thing from a very basic point there is that this complex system, you know, which is supposed to be the opposite of disorder, is better at reducing the sort of gravitational gradient that's there than it would be if it drip. Because if you make this bottle, 2 soda bottles with a little hole and connector, it'll take a long time, drip. But if you give it a little shake, it swirls and comes to the bottom. So this is a little bit off topic, but I'll come back to that. Werner Heisenberg, the famous physicist, he once said that if I get to meet God, there's 2 questions I would like to ask him. One is, why is relativity theory so weird? And the other one is, what is the nature of turbulence? And he said he thinks God would give him an answer to the first question. So these turbulent systems that cycle matter, that reduce gradients, that produce entropy, life is also doing that, as storm systems are. But because it doesn't have the replicative architecture of the nucleotides allow it to continue over evolutionary time, life is much rarer, and we don't really know of any other examples of it. And in Freeman Dyson's dual origin hypothesis that he talks about in Origins of Life, there's some metabolic systems, these kind of cell-like pre-cell systems, and then there's replicating nucleotides, and somehow they symbiotically, even before there was life, connected, and so you got a metabolic twister-like, but more like a chemical twister-like cycling system connected to a nucleotide system that allowed it to replicate and ultimately reproduce, as well as last in the moment, which is what all of the other dissipative structures do. They basically disappear once they run out of energy. They don't have a way of repeating their energy degradation power because they don't have replication, but they do have the sort of ancestral cycling ability that we see in dissipative systems.
Other questions or comments for Dorion?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, I can hear you, Jonathan. Go ahead.
Hi, Dorion. Incredible talk. Thank you very much. It's really like a good book.
I don't see your video. Okay.
Yeah.
No te veo.
Here I am. Yes?
No, for some reason we can't see you. But
no puedo ver tu cara.
In the screen? Hi.
No importa, pero veo su nombre, Jonathan Acosta.
Yeah, well, okay. And here is my question. You have claimed that the presence of the human species is irrelevant for the universe. If so, what is the significance of the selective pressure that humans impose on other living organisms?
Jean-Philippe, can you?
Yes. Say again, Jonathan, in Spanish. Say it in Spanish because we cannot see your lips. It's hard.
¿En español? ¿Que lo diga en español?
Échatela en español y aquí la traducimos.
Ok, bueno, ahí la traduce. Pues que él ha dicho que la humanidad es irrelevante para el universo,
You have claimed that humans are irrelevant for the universe.
Entonces, si es así, ¿cuál es el significado de la actividad del hombre o del hombre si impone presiones de selección sobre los organismos?
If so, then what's the significance of human species pressure, selective pressure on other organisms?
I don't know. I'm not sure that humans are irrelevant for the universe. I mean, they're definitely relevant for us. Otherwise, we wouldn't know the universe. But we have lots of significance for other species. I think mainly negative right now in terms of our, not so much just our growth in numbers, which I alluded to, that have already doubled us, so we're de facto exponentially reproducing, but even greater is the exacerbation of extraction of resource sources, destruction of biomass. I mean, the planet has survived 5 mass extinctions, not including the cyanocene that you referred to, the cyanobacterial production of oxygen in the atmosphere, which was probably even more catastrophic for life at the time than any of those. And it has come back every single time. So I don't think that human beings, even if we wanted to, could destroy life on Earth. But we can make things really bad for us, and we can kill a lot of interesting organisms. And that's sad. I think right now our effect is negative. I think that not just global warming through carbon dioxide, but possibly more importantly, the production of particulate pollution, which has been shown to heat up the planet. So when the Yucatan Cheats Club planetesimal hit and created the destruction that led to the death of the last of the dinosaurs, that's the most memorable of all the mass extinctions, at least from like a 12-year-old boy's point of view. That is usually thought to have created dark and cold, but it probably did block out a lot of plant life because of the particulate pollution. But the particulate pollution probably led to a net increase in heat. And the same is true for nuclear war. And the same is true for gasoline additives, coal fly ash, manufacture industry, automobiles in general. Some of the pictures that we saw after the lockdowns tended to suggest in that direction, that it was cleaner and cooler. And and the same is true for war. All these things are probably heating the planet in the short term. The residence time of CO2 in the atmosphere is a lot longer than these goals that we put up. They block out light in the daytime. They more than make up for the radiation of solar and terrestrial heat at night. So that's just one of the ways. And that could also stop convection, which is part of the atmospheric system. So the continuous transport of heat through the weather systems, like that you see on swirling in the Atlantic Ocean and weather reports, those things can be blocked too by the production of heat near the surface, which, as I alluded to, is something that all the thermodynamic systems are doing. The best ones at it are the ecosystems, and like the Amazon ecosystems, because they're pushing the heat far away from themselves through evapotranspiration. We're burning up everything in sight and choking on it. That doesn't last, So we need to model ourselves more on climax ecosystem, on the rapacious rapid growth that doesn't last. Because right now we're acting like the kind of species that get selected against in the short term. Sort of interesting ecological answer to the Fermi paradox. The Fermi paradox, Enrico Fermi's question.
Go ahead, remind us.
Why haven't we seen them if there's so many aliens? Well, a good answer to that, and before I tell you what it is, I'll say that luminaries as famous as Stephen Hawking and Michio Kaku have both said, Michio Kaku said, oh, the aliens might come and invade us like the Americans did in Vietnam. And then Stephen Hawking, you know, the brilliant physicist who theorized about entropy of black holes, etc. He said, we got to be careful about making too much electromagnetic noise because the aliens are going to come and eat us. I mean, which I think both are ridiculous because, first of all, aliens, if they could notice us like that, why would they come across the universe to have like one garbanzo bean, you know, for and us, they're very sort of projecting our own human experience as warmongers onto others. And really, a better example, a better explanation, I believe, for why, if aliens exist, they haven't visited us, is because aliens that we would recognize, because they also might be all over the place, but we don't recognize them because we're very partial. We don't hardly recognize other life forms on our own planet. Why would we be easily recognize aliens? But if they are out there, they have not come because they're not in an exploitative rapid growth stage. They have already reached a sort of ecological stability that you see in climax ecosystems. They're not expansionists because that's what sort of healthy long-term ecosystems don't grow as fast as they can because that's how they fall apart. That's I like that answer for I don't know what the name of it is, but that's a good ecological Fermi paradox answer.
Very nice. And any other questions or comments? Emmanuel, who is our guest today, good friend, perhaps you want to ask a question. Emmanuel, go ahead, please. Turn on your mic.
It's not on my micro. It's okay.
Now we have it. Yeah, we can.
Sorry. Dorion, it's a pleasure to meet you. When I was a child, I grew with the programs and the books of your father, and it's very special for me and for all of us meeting you and having you on the anniversary of the lab. It's very special. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And well, I'm not a scientist. I'm a lawyer, and I hear your exposition with attention. But I have a question that is not related with sex and with thermodynamics and all these fascinating topics you talk about. My question have a moral, a juridic connotation. What a person like you, what a person like Dorion Sagan propose to democratize not only science, but philosophy and history for present and future generations. So all have a guaranteed access for them. And if you consider these alternatives can be consolidated without intervention of the government.
Well, I don't know the mechanics of it, but I'm all for a Democrat to say, I think it's everybody's birthright. Everybody should be able to learn. Now
That's the question.
Yes. A complex question because not all things that you might learn are equal, but I mean, there is a lot of access, and I think it has to do, there's a lot of bad teachers and good teachers, and it's not necessarily easy to find which one are the good ones. And then there's a problem with the institutional propriety, copyright, patents, but I don't think those are the most exciting things in terms of the future of education. Those are basically capitalistic games and attempts to accumulate that, in the perspective of what we've been talking about, are forms of the sort of rapid growth that ends in collapse that are not long lasting. And it is beautiful that we can look back through the centuries and find what the Socratics thought, and now we can talk to people all over the world. So I think there are opportunities opening up, and I'm definitely for democratization in the form of equal access, but not democratization in the forms of all knowledge being equal, because I think that's part of the excitement, is to find the good stuff. And that doesn't mean that all the stuff is equal. Some stuff is much more interesting than other stuff. And thankfully, that is generally, there's no intrinsic money to be made in finding that kind of information. And I would be suspicious of any knowledge that is surrounded by some sort of, fortress of a political or a legal kind, because that would not be fair, but it's also probably not the really good stuff anyway, because like they say, information, and even more than that, knowledge wants to be free, and it's everybody's birthright. So I agree.
It's interesting. And you think the intervention of government is necessary for a democratization of the knowledge, of the history, or we can have a different system that people can access to knowledge?
Well, I mean, that's a very general question. I mean, to me, when I think of government, I don't think of intelligence or knowledge. I think of power and structure, so.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Well,
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to meet you.
The whole subject of the origins of sex and asexual reproduction has been in the minds of the people you're talking to for the last 6 or 7 months. And that's why it was so pertinent to have a conversation with you, because it was a good reason to be very introspective about what we do rather than experimental. That's one of the things that happened during the lockdown. So I think
I'm not going to praise the lockdown, but I appreciate
it always brings opportunities, to do things differently in that regard. I don't want to compress you more with this question. I think your answers were absolutely fantastic and will make us think for a while. Is there anything else that somebody wants to add up? Perhaps more of an emotional perspective of having Dorion with us. We're almost done. There were some questions that we thought about that perhaps I can bring there's something that has to do with your history, but one of the things that we were wondering, what do you recall on Lynn Margulis' position on gender equity? How did she feel about in science?
Well, that's a very deep and important question. I mean, in a superficial way, she said that she never felt any prejudice from being a woman, but she also told her sisters that they should get into science because that's where the men are. When she came into science, she was a woman among men, and her first major relationship was when she was 16, and she met my dad, who was 19, and it was all bound up with the Cold War and with the excitement. I mean, they had just figured out the structure of the DNA molecule the year before they met in the same University of Chicago. Stanley Miller, under the direction of Harold Urey, was my father's advisor, had put together basic elements and compounds, expose them to electric discharge and get amino acids. They felt like it must have been like, Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein and Mary Shelley's. They were like on the verge of finding out the secrets of life. And when they met, and they had a really bad relationship, but they had really good scientific discussions. And she carried that sort of template of my father onto other scientists. So she was always deeply involved in science. And it's not true that she it's almost certainly not true that she never got any prejudice from being a woman. I mean, Richard Dawkins called her Attila the Hen, which isn't a very nice thing to say, but you know, at that point in her career, she could shrug it off. But she was very reticent to publicly embrace feminism in any way, because the work that she was doing, although you could definitely argue that symbiogenesis was informed by a sort of physical embodied knowledge of women who become pregnant and already have two bodies in one, etc. To say anything like that would open her up to having all of this information that was developed before her, mostly by male scientists like Kosio Polyansky, Ivan Wall in the United States, all the early symbiogenetic work, Marashovsky. But if she were to say it in that way, they would say, "Oh, this is women's science." And she even said she gave like an honorary talk somewhere, and then the provost or somebody introduced her as saying, "Well, this is women's science." Like, no, this is not. So it would be too easy to dismiss it by associating with that. And then there's sort of the affirmative action angle too. You don't want to feel like you're getting a free ride because of your gender, your ethnicity, or your sex, because that's devaluing in a way. At the same time, it should be equal. So I think that in that regard, and despite her great vociferousness, silence was her attitude. But at the same time, I think that because of her particular personality and her kind of like toughness and coldness, and the fact that she liked men, she wasn't nearly as susceptible to some of the horrible prejudices that are visited upon women scientists.
Is there any aspect you value them, particularly of the education you got from them?
From, you mean my parents? Well, I mean, I'm extremely lucky, and you know, to go back to that Freeman Dyson quote about like the symbiosis of galaxies swallowing each other and how scientists can influence each other. Working with my mother, you could say, pre-adapted me to working with other people. You know, my father at one point said, like, if you really want to write about biology, why don't you, you know, stop working with your mother and go to graduate school and get a proper degree? And I was like, and my response to him was, why don't we do something together? But he didn't like that idea either. So I think I have a sort of a symbiogenetic model of working, and the bridge, like the bridges that the plasmids make in bacterial sex, discovered by Joshua Lederberg, is something that I would carry on from my work with my mother to my working with other people, and to trying to be interdisciplinary and seeing how one field can go into the other. And the nice thing about science, like the beauty of it in a way, is that you're not dealing with something very marginal and specific. Each of these things that I had sort of like integrated into this talk here, the biology of aging, just a little bit of symbiogenetics, and evolutionary microbiology, and then on my own, you know, I've read a lot of philosophy. They all are about the same thing from different angles. So the richness there is that that all these fields ultimately connect, and unfortunately, because of the hyperdisciplinarianism in academia, and especially corporatized scientific work, people tend to go further and further down into very specific rabbit holes that and develop specialized terminologies that doesn't allow them to connect. But at the same time, what you're doing in science tends to relate to the whole. So if it's a really robust, rich theory, chances are that it's going to have lots of connections. And a person like me is privileged because I can sit back and take the big view and see and explore how these different fields connect.
We work for you, which is nice. We're glad you exist, Dorion, for sure.
Yeah, I'm glad you do too. Well, I'm very happy to be teleported by Zoom to Mexico briefly, and I'm very thankful. They're thankful to talk to you guys, and it was fun to write my talk.
Thank you, Dorion.
Okay, thank you. Have a bon dia. Muchísimas gracias a todos.
Gracias. Buen día.
Un abrazo fuerte.
Ciao.